Get started. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea. I work for the PSA, as most of you know, who are here today. I will start with whakatauki, as always, before I introduce a guest that will be quite well known to you all right now as well. But let me start with the whakatauki. Kona pai tawhiti whaia kia tata. Kona pai tata whakamaua kia tina. And it means the potential for tomorrow depends on what we do today. And I thought it's quite an appropriate whakatauki because it highlights the importance to consider future generations in what we do today. And obviously the government yesterday has released its budget. And it has implications for those of us who live in New Zealand today, but also for those living in New Zealand tomorrow and the day after. It's very important for future generations, especially with regards to the investments made in health and into the environment. So we'll hear about all of that today from Craig Renney, the economist from the CTU. Maybe you know Craig from an earlier webinar that we did with Bernard Hickey just last week before the budget was released. So welcome everyone to hear from Craig after the budget has been released yesterday, and he will share some of the analysis with us today. So awesome to have you all here. Craig will give us a bit of an overview, as I mentioned, for about half an hour, and then at the end there will be time for questions. So feel free to use the question answer function as always. Try to keep your questions succinct and short. That makes it easier to bring them into the conversation, and they will be clearer as well, and you get the answer that you would like to get. So, I think that's probably all from me, Craig. I'll just hand over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Craig Renney, and I'm the Economist and Director of Policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. Prior to joining the CTU in 2021, I was Grant Robertson's economic advisor for 5 years. So I've written 3 of these budgets and costed 2 manifestos. So I've got a little bit of experience about how they work from the inside. It was another fascinating budget yesterday. It was the 4th wellbeing budget, the 5th budget of this government. And there was a lot of spending. There was a lot of heat. There's been a lot of noise about this budget. It's being seen as a very political budget. There's be an election next year. And what gets done today is what will be on the table at the election time. It's not in the next budget. That will be too late. It's what's actually done today. It's what people will be able to see and feel when they're putting the little X in the box at the next election. With that in mind, I will just briefly take you through what we're going to talk through today. If we can get the IT to work, fantastic. If you could press the button again for me. We'll do a little bit of background to the budget, some politics that have been taking place. What does the budget do overall in terms of the overall fiscal position? What are the economic indicators saying? So what's actually happening rather than what you're being told is actually happening? What investments, and this is really just the key investments, and to put it into context, there are 17 books in the budget, each one of which sets out the investments. I won't run through all of them. I'll just run through the key investments that I think are really noteworthy, but happy to take questions on any investments that you may want to look at. What do we at the CTU think of the budget? And then finally, happy to take any questions that you have then. So one of the things you might want to do in about an hour's time, this document will go online. There's our 50-page analysis going through all of the key sections of the budget, going through setting out what's happened, who's winning, who's losing. If you want to look at any more detail, really understand what's going on in Budget 22, that document will be available from the CTU's website in about an hour and a half's time once the formatting's finished. And I'll happily share the web link with the PSA so that you can share it internally as well. So back onto the budget, I don't need to tell anybody on this call that the cost of living and inflation has really dominated headlines over the past few weeks. Inflation is currently 6.9%, and that's the highest it's been in 30 years. For low income groups, it's actually much higher than that because more of their income is taken up with rent, with food, with fuel. And as a consequence, they're paying even more than that. And there are some Treasury estimates that currently inflation for low income groups is around 25% rather than 6.9%. And as a consequence, this has been causing no end of problems for the government. Tied with that, slowdowns in China caused by COVID resurgence, the conflict in the Ukraine, and supply chain bottlenecks and supply chain disruptions, we had weaker than expected international growth. That feeds through in New Zealand to weaker than expected tax revenue. That means the Crown has less to spend, or if it wants to spend the same, it has to borrow more. No finance minister wants to make that decision, but that's been forced upon this finance minister as a consequence of the economic context that we find ourselves in. Together with that, there's been an increasing political narrative. You've often heard the drumbeat of this call for wasteful spending. Anytime the government tries to spend anything, it's wasteful. And anytime the government tries to do anything the opposition doesn't agree with, it's wasteful spending. And you've seen that grow more and more currency with the public. I don't personally believe it, but it's a story which is gathering traction with the public. At exactly the same time, the government actually should be investing. We have long-term underinvestments in many core parts of the public sector and certainly in parts of the public realm. The Treasury identified a $104 billion infrastructure gap that exists in New Zealand right now. That's $104 billion of public sector infrastructure that should exist, that we don't have funding for. And that gap is going to grow larger and larger and larger unless we invest and get ahead of the investments that we need to make. So at exactly the same time we should be investing, we should be looking through some short-run economic wobbles that we have. We've got this narrative of wasteful spending, and it's triangulating the government. It's making any additional expenditure very difficult to talk to. Finally, the needs of New Zealanders are growing. We've seen the social housing wait list grow to 25,000 households. Child poverty indicators haven't continued to decline in the way that the government would certainly want them to have declined. In fact, the after housing cost child indicator is going backwards. And we've got this backlog of unmet health needs as a consequence of COVID, hospitals having to close, wards having to close, and as a consequence, there's a backlog of need which needs to be met again and need to find funding for that. Now, at this point in time, as an economist, I have to give you a legal disclaimer, which is that everything that's in here is basically a Treasury forecast. Treasury forecasts are what we like to call in the trade an evolving art. Now, I'm not having go any of my former Treasury colleagues. I am not. The Treasury puts together the budget with great care and attention, and there are lots of Treasury analysts who work more hours than they should pulling the document together. But Treasury forecasts are just that. They are forecasts. They're often wrong. They're often wrong in many ways, and so you shouldn't take too much store by what's in the forecasts, especially as you go out a few years. Think of it as a guide rather than as an absolute decision as to where things are going to. So what does the budget do overall? I would argue, and the CTU argue, this budget has been precision engineered not to really scare anyone. There are no very significant investments with one exception, which does anything that anyone can really disagree with. It's very difficult to disagree with the investments in health. There's a long-standing need in health. It's well understood. Clearing the debt in health makes perfect sense. It's very difficult to argue with that one. But there's no big spending in a controversial area or any big removal of spending from a controversial area. The budget also draws a line in the sand. The Minister of Finance during the presentations talked repeatedly about the previous two budgets being crisis budgets, dealing with COVID, dealing with its aftermath, dealing with the public health consequences. This is a line in the sand. This is about returning to what Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister, called a new normal. And we'll come on to that phrase because it's actually quite important. There was record new operating spending as part of this. So operating spending, day-to-day spending rather than capital spending, which is spending you spend on physical things, assets that you own for a long period of time. And that operating spending was $6 billion this year. That's the largest for many a year, even on an inflation-adjusted basis. But despite all of that spending, there's a gradual return to normal in all of the economic indicators. We're seeing a gradual return to basically the kind of situation that we saw before COVID, where debt is around 20% of GDP, government spending is around 30% of GDP. And you can basically draw a straight line straight through from where Bill English and John Key were to where Grant Robertson is right now. The Treasury consensus on what the government should be doing has won in that space. Government debt and spending levels remain steady or actually fall across the forecast period. The government is spending across the forecast period 30.8% of GDP. That is exactly the same as the forecast as the period between John Key and Bill English. Now, there are some very specific funding for health, climate change, and some welfare payments, and we'll come on to those in a little bit more detail. But it's fair to say that for health, this is actually life-changing amounts of money. But if you take nothing else away from this presentation, take this. 70% of all of the spending inside this budget, this big spending budget, is just to keep the lights on. It's actually not to do anything new. And that's up from 59% at the last budget. And that's the impact of inflation on the budget. So the majority of the spending here is not actually to do anything new. It's not to do anything sexy or different. It's actually just to keep the lights on. And as has been well advertised, there was a temporary cost of living adjustment designed for the squeezed middle. So those who don't receive Crown support in any other way, but who may well be doing it tough because they're on a low to middle income. So what are the economic indicators saying? Now, we've heard a lot of stories, and there have been very erudite and well-paid economists who are telling us we're heading for a recession. Things are looking very bleak. Let me be the first to tell you that economics is called the dismal science for a reason. Where we can professionally both bore you and terrify you at the same time. The Treasury, however, doesn't see a recession. The Treasury sees growth in every year of the forecast period, and growth in the next year is actually higher than was forecast a year ago. It's lower later on, but next year it's higher than was forecast, and we've seen growth be higher across each of those years than was forecast last year. So the economy's actually done better. The resilience to COVID is demonstrated in that chart. And if we look at unemployment, again, it's the same story. Now, the red line represents what we thought unemployment was going to be at the height of COVID. Unemployment was going to spike to 10%. We set up the wage subsidy scheme in anticipation of hundreds of thousands of job layoffs at that particular point in time. Thankfully, that never occurred. And then a year later, at budget 21, we had a yellow line on the chart. So we thought unemployment was going to rise gently, but quite rapidly up to 5.5%, and then gradually decline from there. What's happened in reality is unemployment has sunk to a new low, to 3.2%. And the Treasury now forecasts that unemployment will fall to a 30-odd year low of 3%. That is effectively full employment in New Zealand. We have not seen that level of employment since the 1970s. It then starts to rise after that, actually mainly as a consequence of the Treasury's forecasting model. Treasury's forecasting model has a longer-term average of unemployment of around 4.2, 4.5%, and so it assumes you head back to that place over time. But there's going to be sustained low unemployment in the forecast period. And we can demonstrate this again with the job seeker numbers, because you can be on job seeker but not unemployed. So we can see the number of job seekers in the black line, which is the line from this budget, is lower than the forecast a year ago, but back towards the end period starts to peak. Again, much lower than the figures that we anticipated at the height of COVID. At the height of COVID, we were expecting 250,000 people to be on job seeker. So at 180,000, 70,000 away from that. And we should really credit the success of the government's response to COVID and keeping people both in work and keeping the economy going during COVID. Now, for many of you, one of the key things, if not you'd be really wanting to know, essentially is, what's my wage and what's inflation? And am I getting ahead or am I going backwards? Because currently, a lot of people feel as if they're going backwards. Now, on the screen, you'll find a black line. That black line is CPI inflation. The red line is the quarterly earnings survey, annual hourly hours, hourly wages. So this is the average wage on average across New Zealand and the growth of that. And you can see in the lead up to 2021, 2022, hourly wages were rising faster than inflation. People were getting ahead. This year, not so much, and people can feel that. And I don't need to tell people on the call that they can feel what's going on there. But good news, the Treasury is of the strong opinion that starting from June 2022, hourly wages will start rising faster than inflation again. New Zealand workers, on average, lots of workers won't, but on average, New Zealand workers will start getting ahead of inflation and start seeing real wage increases. And there's real wage increases every year in the forecast period. So by the time you get to 24, 25, wages are rising roughly twice as fast as inflation. So there's some real heat in the economy and workers will start to feel the benefit of that, albeit a little bit, starting from next year. Now, for many of you, you'll also be concerned about house prices. If, like me, you've been stupid enough to buy a house recently, you may well have a mortgage, which keeps you awake at night, and you're now worrying about whether or not the mortgage on the house is now worth less than the property that you purchased it. Now, the news from this current document, from the current budget, is not great on that behalf, but it's also not apocalyptic. We see a roughly 2.5% fall in house prices penciled in for the next financial fiscal year, which is 2022-2023. That's coming off the back of a 30% increase in 2020-2021 and a 5% increase in this year. It then returns basically to flat line across the forecast period. And if you were to draw this line longer out of time in terms of the Treasury's forecast, it actually remains flat across the time period. So with inflation being higher than house prices, essentially the value of your mortgage and the value of house prices will decouple over time in a very gradual sense, according to the Treasury. But what there's not is a 1980s or 1990s style house price crash penciled in here. So if you've just bought a house or you're looking for a house, I haven't got good news for you, but I also don't have terrible news. Now, with all of that in mind, strong economy, low unemployment, wages getting ahead of inflation, and house prices not disappearing through the floor, what investments is the budget making? Now, what we're not doing is borrowing a huge amount of money. Net core crown debt, which is the old tax measure, I won't bore you with the details of why, but net core crown debt, as you can see, in every year post-2018 is lower than it was anticipated to be just a year ago. In fact, net core crown debt peaks in this year, that's forthcoming, and then starts to broadly decline. And again, if you were to draw this chart out again, you would see that decline continue and continue and continue, back down to around 30% 10 years from now. So essentially, there is no debt crisis in New Zealand, and there certainly is no public debt crisis in New Zealand. Most countries which are comparable with New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, the UK, would happily sell their firstborn into bonded slavery to have the net core crown debt figures that we have. We have enormous levels of fiscal headroom, and we have AAA rated accounts. We have absolutely no problems with debt in New Zealand. And what we also see is that net core crown expenses, so what we're spending, spiked in 2020 and in 1920, as you would expect. COVID fell back as we thought we'd beaten COVID. Omicron turns up, we start spending more money again because we have more wage subsidies, we're spending more money to support the economy. But after that, we see net core crown expenses start to fall year on year on year. Again, back to that long run consensus around 30% of GDP. And we see net core crown revenue rise in each year of the forecast period, but again, gently rise in each year of the forecast period, which suggests it's growth, it's economic growth, and it's expenditure that's driving that. So there's nothing terribly exciting in these figures, but that's also good news. We're not anticipating the crown spending all of the money or desperately going in a cash splash, and we're not seeing more and more and more of what's in your pocket being eaten away by taxation. Now, this is a slightly complicated chart, so I hope we have a large screen as I do here. But why I put this on here because what I really want you to understand is how skewed all of the new spending is in the budget. On the left-hand side, as it is for me, you have health. The red bars represent what happened in 21-22, the black bars 22-23, and the grey bars are 23-24. And what you can see is health, social security, and education are the big winners from budgets, this budget and the next budget, in terms of where all the cash is going. Health, because we're paying off the debt of the DHBs and we're investing record amounts of money in health service purchasing. Social security and welfare, because at the last budget, we saw big increases in welfare payments, pencil, which started on the 1st of April this year. And we're seeing some further big increases in things like disability support come through. And then education, because we're seeing the reform of vocational education reforms, and we're seeing the equity indexes and other things come through, which is lifting education expenditure. What you can then see beyond those big three, there aren't really big increases anywhere else. Environmental protection, which reflects the expenditure through the emissions reductions plan documents into the climate change expenditure. But when you look at defence, you look at economic services, you look at core government services, they're all dwarfed by health expenditure and they're dwarfed by social security and education. Now, before anybody gets worried about that, that's pretty normal, but we're at the extreme end of normal. We're seeing these large increases certainly show you where the marginal dollars, where those tax differences are going and our spending is going in New Zealand: health, social security, and education. And if we look to the main spending areas outlined in this budget, and if anybody wants to find out where all these things are, there are two documents I'd recommend. One of which is this thick document, which is the Wellbeing Budget actual publication, front cover by the Right Honourable Grant Robertson. This is actually his photo, and it's there. At the back of this document is a thing called the Summary of Initiatives, and it sets out for everyone what every line of new expenditure is. So if you want to look for your area, or you want to know what's going on for an area that you have a particular interest in, this will set out for the forecast period every cent of new expenditure and laid out clearly what it's going to be spent on. And it's not a straightforward read, but it's a much easier read than anything else. If that's too hard or you don't have time, this document, which is what we call the Budget at a Glance, which sets out in a pamphlet form, in a really easy form, actually what's actually in here. So if you take nothing else away, that is available, and that will tell you in a really short order what's actually there. But the key takeaways: health saw $11.1 billion of new spending over the next 2 years. Now, a part of that is going to pay off the debt of the DHBs as they move into the new health structure. But significant amounts, $1.8 billion this year, $1.3 billion in the next year, is going into health services to provide certainty of funding, but also to provide the kinds of levels of funding to give the health service what the Minister of Health called a sustainable financial footing. Together with that, there's $1.3 billion of new capital spending that's outlined in the budget. Again, That means there's now $6.5 billion of capital spending taking place in health over the next few years. To put that into context, in 2017, health capital spending was $350 million. So we're spending many multiples on health capital, rebuilding hospitals, rebuilding health centres, delivering new IT, delivering new systems, and catching up with the more than $15 billion infrastructure gap that exists in health in New Zealand. There was $1 billion outlined for disability services, including a new ministry for disability. With the majority of that funding, $700 million going into the Disability Services Support Scheme, which will provide goods and services for people who have particular needs. Now, great, lots of money, fantastic. Question. There's no new money in here for health service reorganisation. So at the last budget, $468 million was set aside for health service reorganisation. Everything we know from overseas, from health road service reorganisation, is that reorganising your health service is both expensive and time consuming. And $468 million across a 3-4 year period might not touch the sides. So where is the money for any further call on health service reorganisation going to come from? And it's not clear in this service. Is it coming from health services itself, or is it coming from somewhere else? Or is the Crown going to put up more money if that's the case? But the fact there's not even any contingency money that we can see does raise questions about to what extent there is sufficient money in the health system right now, despite record spending, to actually deal with the reorganisation that might take place. There was also a very small amount of money, $76 million, of which only $39 million is real, for health services and health workforces to create the nurses, the doctors, the psychiatrists, psychologists, the physiotherapists. That's a really small amount of money. That's actually a highly inadequate amount of money, and really won't go anywhere near to tackle the 4,000 places and empty nursing spots that we have in New Zealand. In terms of climate change, the big news was announced on Monday ahead of the budget when the emissions reductions plan was announced, and as signalled, $4.5 billion of new spending to support climate change and to support emissions reductions has been outlined. And the government has spent somewhere in the order of 60% of that already on new initiatives that will deliver climate change reductions to deliver on our new climate budgets. But very immediately, the government committed to public transport prices continuing to be halved for the next 2 months. On the other side of that, it also kept the fuel duty cut. So quite how you're managing your climate change emissions during that is a bit of a mixed bag. But it's fair to say 2 months, the government's taking a big bet. The government's essentially saying in 2 months' time, inflation will be lower. I think that's a bit of a gamble, to be honest. And we might well be back here in 2 months' time begging for another cut in both public transport and fuel duty. Now, in justice, there was a really interesting decision in justice to move to what's called a cluster approach. And the justice cluster is not only justice, but it's a range of departments and areas like police, like corrections, like the Attorney General. And that was given $2.7 billion in total new operating spending and $25 million in new capital funding for a shared service, shared outcome set of activities. And this is really innovative and new. We're going to have to see whether or not that works, how the transparency and the lines of responsibility work for this in the future. But if it does work, it may well lead to that cluster approach being delivered in new areas, in social development, being delivered in housing, in elsewhere, where you bring departments together and you pool sets of funds in ways that are highly unusual in the New Zealand experience. But that funding is really welcome. There's really welcome funding for both public servants in that money, for policy development in that money, and for the expansion of policy services at justice. There's also money to clear backlogs for both the court system and for other systems that have been clogged up as a consequence of COVID. In education, there were essentially two big spending announcements, one of which was $300 million to replace the decile index with an equity index. Now, that's great. It goes some of the way to address that problem, not all of the way. We're roughly speaking, we're half the way there. Across the developed world, equity funding makes up, generally speaking, around 6% of all education funding. In New Zealand, it's 3.6% now. But again, it's a step beyond where we were. And it will certainly make for a fairer distribution, we hope, of scarce education resources across schools. In less good news, well, in good news and in bad news, $266 million for pay equity for ACE teachers, hugely welcome, absolutely necessary. But we're still only a little bit equal. We're not all the way there equal. It's a bit like being a bit pregnant. You're a bit equal. So there's still parts of the ECE chain who will not feel the value of pay equity funding, particularly in management. So we need to see continued investment in that space. But $266 million will make a huge difference for many ECE staff and for many ECE centres up and down New Zealand. In housing, we saw an additional $1 billion to support emergency, temporary and new state housing. Now, great, fantastic, there's huge need in housing. The challenge we have is this is rent. This is not buying new places. This is just simply supporting places we already have or supporting the rents for new state properties that we've just built. Great news, but it doesn't build a new home. It just keeps the motels open. It just keeps the temporary emergency places open. We need to be seeing huge levels more investment in housing. It's the biggest driver of poverty. It's the biggest driver of poor health outcomes. It's the biggest driver of inequality in New Zealand. And we don't invest anywhere near enough to make that problem go away in New Zealand. And the $1 billion is very welcome, but it just keeps the lights on in the current system rather than doing anything new or exciting. And then finally, in economic development, and this thing, you asked me what my Christmas present was in this. There's a range of investment to support things like fair pay agreements, which is hugely welcome in the system. The budget provided funding to provide for 2 new fair pay agreement settlements in each year, the forecast period. And it also provided money for the continued development of the New Zealand Income Insurance Scheme, which is currently it's having a reading for ACC through the House right now. It's budget urgency, and both of those we think in the future will make an enormous difference to industrial relations and to workplace relations in New Zealand. And the Crown signalled very welcome funding for both policy development, but also to make sure that we can, when we get through legislation, if we decide to get there, then these things can both happen, and it can happen really well. So really welcome stuff, and that really was my Christmas present. So any slight technical issue with the old PowerPoint. Brute force it, fantastic. Now, again, one thing that you may well have heard as part of this budget, and the one thing that the press and commentators have been fantastically interested in talking about is this cost of living payment that's being made to people. So the budget included $1 billion cost of living package, of which approximately $800 million was provided to people who are on low and middle incomes and who don't receive any other form of support, in particular the winter energy payment. Now, that provides $350 in 3 monthly installments. You don't need to apply for this. It will be worked out automatically for you. And you will receive it in 3 parts, and it's to help manage the cost of living challenges that many of us face right now. It's worth approximately $27 a week for those 3 months. And for many people, especially in a household where both earners receive that level of income, that's essentially $54 a week extra to that household, and it will benefit 2.1 million New Zealanders. It's the rabbit from the hat. The Minister of Finance often keeps a special surprise underneath the table and just pulls it out and says, there you go, this is the surprise. That's what everyone's going to talk about. And certainly on the day, that's exactly what everyone was talking about. It reflects that cost of living challenge that the New Zealanders face right now, but it is temporary. And again, we may well be asking ourselves in a few months' time, what's next? So what do we think? There's plenty to like in this budget. It's cost of living payment. There's funding and long-term funding for essential public services. There's money for schools, for hospitals, for ambulances. There's money for the public service. We haven't shied away from looking through some of the current economic uncertainties and making sure we're investing in the long-term things, the things actually we know make a difference to so many people in New Zealand. And with a relatively calm, benign economic and fiscal indicators, a new normal is being delivered. 20% of GDP debt, 30% of GDP expenditure. The new normal looks an awful lot like the old normal. The question for me as an economist, and the thing that I'm really fascinated about, is that what we want? Is that what good looks like for New Zealand? Are we ambitious for more? Or do we actually just want to go back to where things were? I passionately believe that we shouldn't have just spent $74 billion in tackling COVID to go back to the problems that we had before COVID. We shouldn't spend that sum of money to have the same homelessness challenges, to have the same child poverty challenges, to have the same underfunded and poor public services in places. And so we should use that to deliver a better future. And I don't want to go back to normal. Normal wasn't great for too many people. There's plenty of fiscal space for further investment in the future. We do have to walk a careful line. We can't just spend the money. You know, I've heard some commentators say there's $50 billion available. Why don't we just spend it? Why don't we just set it aside, spend it, and we can make enormous differences in New Zealand. We couldn't spend that money if we tried. There's not the people to spend it on. If I wanted to build stuff, there's no gym in New Zealand. There's not enough concrete in New Zealand. So we couldn't do it. But there's plenty of fiscal space for us to have a plan and for us to be able to set out what good looks like and how we're going to get there. And that's my takeaway from this. The CTU would welcome more of a plan in the budget or a plan from government to build the country, to address our essential service needs and to fill that $104 billion infrastructure gap in a meaningful timetable, not just between now and the heat death of the universe. The good news for everybody here is there's one more budget to go before we have an election. It's one more chance to get this right. And we hope and want to work with the government and with unions and delegates and officials and with NGOs to see if we can get that plan for the country because everything else is there. The economic and fiscal indicators tell us we can do more, we should do more. Let's do it together. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you. My God, Craig, that was amazing. You must have worked very hard last night to really get into the detail, analyze all the different votes and really get a good and deep understanding for what you just shared with us. So thank you so much, really valuable. We are very close to the end of the webinar already. We had a few questions here, which I might pass on to you. Of course. To answer, but there were a number of questions related to wages and to funding of pay equity in other areas. You talked about education, but so maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit. And in terms of wages, there was one question about bringing wages more in line with Australian wages. And does the budget actually help anything? Or does anything to support that? So maybe those two areas you could briefly talk about before we close.
Yeah, very quickly. In terms of pay equity, the government's always in an invidious position because it can't tell you how much it will spend because otherwise it's not a negotiation. So the government generally doesn't say unless it's got an agreement. We will spend up to $1 billion on pay equity for nurses or teachers or economists, because the first thing the economists union would turn around and say, $1 billion, you say, great. Well, that's our starting point, and we'll negotiate up from there. So they never really put the numbers in unless there's an agreement. However, Table 6, for those who are particularly well acquainted, of the back of the Budget Economic and Fiscal Update contains a line called the unallocated contingencies line. Yeah. The unallocated contingencies line this year has grown significantly. That suggests that there is some money tucked away for pay equity deals by the government. So we have some hope that money has been set aside. Obviously, negotiations will still have to take place. But outside pay equity for ECE teachers, I would say it's up to the unions and it's up to bargainers to get that deal going. And it's also up to the government to come to the table, as it hasn't done for nurses or for allied workers or elsewhere. Now, in terms of Australia, I'm going to give you a really simple and straightforward answer. Australia has fair pay agreements. New Zealand does not have fair pay agreements. Australia has national awards. New Zealand does not have national awards. As we get fair pay agreements, and as they spread out across workforces, occupations, and industries, I think we'll see that gap with Australia start to close.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, because that's very hopeful, and we are on a good path to actually implementing fair pay agreement, or implementing fair pay agreements, getting a bill for fair pay agreements, and then going for implementation. So thank you so much, Craig, for sharing this really awesome analysis with us. I thought it was very accessible. It can be very difficult to understand the budget and all the different nuances to it. So that was really useful, and I'm sure everyone online enjoyed it as well. I will pass on the questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us again today. It's always wonderful to have you in our webinars. Thanks for all the support behind the scenes, and do please check out the CTU's budget report, which was mentioned by Craig earlier on. It will be released in roughly half an hour, maybe?
Half an hour, 3/4 of. Well, I'm going to run back to the CTU and see if I can press the go button.
Fantastic. So it should be available on your website,
yes.
I guess. Yeah. So please check it out there, and hopefully it will be a good year for all of us ahead. Thank you very much. And I will close us with a whakatauki. Naku te rauro, nau te rauro, ka ora ai te iwi. With your basket and my basket, we will sustain everyone. So thank you everyone for coming on, and stay well.